Okay, so you've probably seen all these headlines flying around about a bunch of Venezuelan migrants deported from the U.S., right?
Yeah, it's been all over the news lately.
Exactly. And, those headlines can be kind of like clickbaity and you're not really sure what's going on.
Totally just scratching the surface.
Yeah, so today we're going to like totally ditch the surface and go for a deep dive into what's actually happening here.
We're going deep.
Super deep.
And the specific thing we're diving into is this deportation of these Venezuelan migrants. And they're suspected of being gang members, and they were sent to like a supermax prison in El Salvador.
A supermax prison whale.
Yeah, so that's kind of the focus here.
Intense.
And the main source we're using for this is a really in-depth report from BBC News. They did a great job covering this whole event, and they provide a lot of really helpful background, too.
BBC always coming through.
They're solid.
Yeah, so for all of you listening out there, our big goal today is to help you understand a few key things. Who are these people? What's the reason behind this decision to send them to El Salvador? And what are the legal and ethical questions that this whole situation is raising?
Definitely, those are the big ones.
Yeah, and we'll also kind of unpack this gang they're supposedly connected to get a bit of their history and how they operate.
All right, sounds like a plan.
So let's jump right in.
Okay, so the BBC report confirms that, yeah, over 200 Venezuelan migrants were deported from the U.S. and sent to El Salvador.
Okay, so that much is clear.
Yeah, and here's where it gets interesting. This happened even after a U.S. federal judge said, hold up, block similar deportations.
Wait, really? So a judge actually stepped in?
Yeah, there's this law called the Alien Enemies Act, super old, like 18th century stuff.
Wow. Going way back.
Yeah, and it was meant for, like, wartime threats, you know?
Oh, so like totally different context.
Exactly.
Huh. So how did they deport them if a judge said no?
Well, that's where things get a little murky. The White House is saying this deportation went down before the judge's ruling was, like, finalized.
Ah, so it was like a timing loophole or something.
Could be. Yeah, so right away we're seeing this complicated situation, conflicting timelines, interpretations. It's messy.
Definitely not straightforward at all.
Nope. And to really get why the U.S. government did this, the BBC report highlights some strong statements from U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He did an interview with CBS and didn't hold back.
Oh, so he was pretty upfront about it.
Yeah, he basically said the U.S. wants to get rid of these individuals straight up.
Whoa, okay, so he's not mincing words.
Not at all. He specifically named them as suspected members of the Tren de Aragua gang, and he labeled them as terrorists.
So that's a pretty serious accusation.
Yeah, and he also mentioned that the president actually officially designated this group as a terrorist organization.
Based on his recommendation.
Right.
So this is like high-level stuff going on.
Absolutely, and if we zoom out a bit, Rubio's statements really show us that the U.S. government's main priority here is preventing crime and keeping the country safe. National security, public safety, it's all connected.
Right. They want to make sure anyone they see as a threat is out of the country.
Exactly. And this terrorist designation that carries a lot of weight, it changes how U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agencies can go after this group and its members.
Oh, so it's not just words. It has real consequences.
Definitely. Okay, so that's the U.S. side of things. But now let's flip the script and talk about these migrants, the alleged gang members of Tren de Aragua. Who are they really?
Right. We need to understand who we're actually talking about.
Yeah, so the BBC report does a deep dive into the origins of Tren de Aragua, and it's fascinating but also kind of disturbing. They started in a prison, like an actual prison in Venezuela.
Wow, a prison. That's crazy.
Yeah, and this prison became like their base of operations. It's where they built their power and influence.
It's like a breeding ground for a whole gang.
Pretty much, and it gets worse. They didn't stay put in that prison.
Of course not. They probably wanted to expand their operation.
Exactly, and as Venezuelans started migrating across the region in big numbers in recent years, Tren de Aragua followed them.
So they were like spreading their influence alongside the Venezuelan diaspora.
Right, and this is crucial to understand how they work. They often preyed on these vulnerable migrants, their own people.
Oh, wow. So they were exploiting people who were already struggling.
Yeah, it's a really messed up situation.
Definitely. And now, as Rubio said, the U.S. is calling them a terrorist organization. That's a huge deal.
It's a major shift in how the U.S. is dealing with them. It means they can watch them more closely, punish them more harshly, and get different government agencies working together to stop them.
So things are escalating quickly.
For sure. Now let's shift gears and look at El Salvador's role in all of this.
Yeah, why El Salvador? What's their connection?
Well, this is where President Nayib Bukele comes in. He's become pretty famous for being super tough on crime in El Salvador.
I've heard about him. He's got that strongman image going on.
Totally. And a big part of his strategy is this prison he built, the Terrorist Confinement Center. They call it CECOT.
Siacut, got it. What's so special about this prison?
It's a supermax prison, like maximum security.
Oh, wow. So like the most hardcore criminals go there.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
designed to hold people who are considered the most dangerous for a long time. And it's super strict, super isolated.
So the U.S. and El Salvador made a deal to send these deported Venezuelans to this CECOT place.
Exactly. According to the BBC report, that's the agreement.
And I'm guessing the U.S. is footing the bill for all of this.
You guessed right. The BBC report says it's something like $6 million a year.
6 million. Wow, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, that's probably covering the cost of housing and keeping all these suspected gang members locked up in CECOT.
Which brings up a whole bunch of questions and concerns, right?
Definitely. Like, first off, what about due process? Were these people given a fair chance to defend themselves before being shipped off to another country?
That's a really good point. Were their rights respected?
Exactly. Human rights groups are worried that maybe they weren't given proper legal representation or a chance to make their case, you know?
Right. That's a major issue.
And then there's the whole question of what it's like inside CECOT itself, the conditions in that supermax prison.
Yeah, what's it actually like in there?
Well, the BBC report used this phrase, a lot of herm, which basically means we don't really know what's going on in there.
So it's all very secretive,
Yeah, and human rights groups are super concerned about how the inmates are being treated.
which makes sense. It's a supermax prison after all.
Right. And here's another thing. The Salvadoran government admitted that they accidentally arrested some innocent people during their crackdown on gangs.
Wait, really? So they just rounded people up and some of them were totally innocent?
Yeah, it seems like they ended up releasing those people, but it shows that their system isn't perfect.
It's kind of scary to think about being in the wrong place at the wrong time and ending up in a supermax prison.
Totally. And even though the Salvadoran government says this whole thing is working, that crime is down because of it.
Sure, but at what cost, right?
Exactly. That's the big question. And the BBC report talks about how inmates spend like 23 and a half hours every day stuck in their cells with other people.
Oh, wow. So they're basically in solitary confinement.
Pretty much, they only get like 30 minutes outside their cells for anything else.
That sounds brutal, like incredibly isolating.
Yeah, it raises serious concerns about their mental and physical well-being.
Definitely. Okay, so let's go back to Tren de Aragua for a minute and really dig into their history. How did they become what they are today?
So the name Tren de Aragua, it means train of Aragua. Literally.
I was wondering about that. What's the train connection?
The BBC report explains that it comes from a union in the Aragua state of Venezuela. They were building a railroad.
Oh, wow. So from railroad workers to a notorious gang, that's a wild journey.
Yeah, it's a strange twist of fate. And as we talked about before, they really got their start in the Venezuelan prison system.
Right, it all goes back to that prison.
Yeah, the core members of the gang, they were all convicted criminals. And they started out extorting people inside the prison, demanding money, controlling the other inmates.
So they created their own little criminal empire within the prison walls.
Exactly, but they wanted more. They weren't content with just the prison.
So they branched out.
Yeah, over time, they started expanding their operations outside the prison into nearby towns, and eventually they had a presence all over Venezuela.
So they were like a virus spreading throughout the country.
Pretty much, and this internal expansion set the stage for them to go international.
And that coincided with the mass exodus of Venezuelans, right?
Exactly. After 2013, Venezuela's economy and society really started falling apart, and millions of people fled the country. The BBC report says it was something like 8 million people.
8 million. Wow, that's a huge number of people.
It is, and tragically, Tren de Aragua saw this as an opportunity. They followed these migration routes and exploited these vulnerable people for their own gain.
So they were basically profiting off of people's desperation.
It's a really awful situation.
Definitely. And now they're operating in multiple countries across the region.
Yeah, the BBC report specifically mentions Colombia, Chile, Peru as places where they're active.
And they've even popped up in the U.S., right?
Yeah, U.S. authorities say they've caught people who are part of Tren de Aragua right here in the U.S.
So this is a truly international criminal organization we're dealing with.
Absolutely. It shows you how connected the world is and how problems in one place can spill over into other countries.
Which brings us to you, the listener. Why should you care about this?
Well, this whole situation touches on some really big issues. International law, human rights, immigration, transnational crime. You know, these are things that affect everyone in some way.
It's like taking these huge, complicated concepts and making them real, showing how they play out in people's lives.
Exactly. It's not just some abstract legal debate. This is about real people being deported to a supermax prison in another country. It's about international relations and the consequences of our actions.
And it shows how something like a mass migration crisis can have ripple effects that we might not even anticipate, like creating these situations where national security clashes with human rights on a global scale.
Definitely, it's a complex web of interconnected issues.
All right, so let's wrap things up with a quick recap. We talked about the U.S. deporting over 200 Venezuelan migrants suspected of being part of Tren de Aragua to a supermax prison in El Salvador.
Right, and this move has sparked a lot of controversy. There are legal challenges against it, and human rights groups are worried about due process and the conditions these people are facing in that prison.
And we explored Tren de Aragua itself, this Venezuelan gang that started in a prison and then spread internationally, following Venezuelan migrants and exploiting them along the way.
It's a pretty disturbing story, and it leads to a really important question for everyone listening. Think about this. In a world where people are constantly moving and crime crosses borders, what happens when countries start outsourcing their detention of individuals to other countries?
Right, it's like passing the buck on a global scale.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what does that mean for things like national sovereignty and international responsibility? These are huge questions that we need to keep asking ourselves.
It's something to really ponder, especially as the world becomes more and more interconnected.
Definitely. This is a topic that deserves our attention, and it's a conversation that needs to continue.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, folks.
Until next time.
Stay curious out there.